In this video, we're going to discuss overloading and inheritance with C#. These are two concepts that are foundational to object-oriented programming. Let's start with overloading. Overloading allows you to have multiple methods with the exact same name, but that have different method signatures. This allows developers to choose the method signature that best fits the situation that they're in. And a great example of this would be if we wanted to initialize our constructor, for example, in this case, the point constructor, in a number of different ways. We could also allow, instead of hard coding 3 and 4, we create another constructor with the exact same name, so in other words, public point, but this time take int x and int y, and then set our member field x to the value of x that was passed in to our constructor, and the member field y to the value y that was passed into our constructor. So now basically we have two methods that have the exact same name. However, when we call them up from our calling application, we'll have an option. So let's do that real briefly with the with this application that we created in the previous lesson. Let's comment out this line, which, by the way, you can comment by using two forward slashes. And so we'll redo this line exactly. And notice when we get to this point here, when I have the open parentheses, that now I get, we can draw this, one of two. That means we have two options here. I can select point with no method signature, meaning that we're going to hard code the values of x and y, or as I use my down arrow key, I can see now the second option, which shows that we can pass in x and y. So I could pass in 5 and 6. So this allows us to have multiple method signatures for the exact same method. We did it with a constructor, but we could do it with any of the methods that we have within our class. Now we're going to use this as we talk about inheritance. But before we can illustrate inheritance, we need to do a little bit more housekeeping. Because we've created a console application and it's an executable, and because our class point is in the executable and we need to access it from multiple applications, we need to take out this class and put it into its own assembly, its own DLL, so that it can be accessed from both the current project that we're in right now and the project that ultimately we will inherit from the point class. So to do this, I'm going to move our viewable area over to the Solution Explorer. I'm going to right-click and select Add New Project. We're going to create a class library, and we're going to call this 2308 point. Select OK. So now we have 2308 point, and I'm going to move the window back over so that we can see into our main area. It has given us class 1. So what we'll do is cut the point class out from our old application, and we will replace it in our new application. So we'll need to compile this. I'm going to save this, and then we're going to build 2308. We were able to build that successfully. Now we need to create a reference from our project into this, and the way that we'll do that, again, is through the Solution Explorer. We're going to right-click and say Add Reference. We're going to find 2308 point, which was created for us, and then select OK. And now we'll notice that we have a reference to 2308. We'll also hit using 2308 point. So let's change the namespace over here. Okay, it's already underscore 2308 point. So now let's save that, rebuild the solution, and make sure that the references can be found. Whoops. And you'll notice when we did this that we actually get an error. It says inaccessible due to its protection level. That's because in our new class, namespace 2308 point, we need to add that it's a public class. And we'll rebuild that first. And now this should work. Great. Seems to work. Let's test it just to make sure that our old application will work with these new modifications. Okay. I kind of forgot there. Let's go 2308. And it seems to work just fine. So that's great news. Okay, now we're going to illustrate inheritance. So what we'll do to get started is hit File, New Project, and we will create a console application called 2309. And the first thing that we're going to do is create a reference to the 2308 point. And so now we can see that we have a reference to that assembly. We'll move our Solution Explorer back over. Now we need to use the using keyword. So now we have access to 2308 point. This is significant because we'll need to have access to it in order to inherit from it. So the first thing that we'll do, just to prove it to ourselves that we can do this, it does show up as we drop down, and it does show up here, so we're in great shape. We'll pass in 3 and 4, and we're good to go. Okay. So this is how I can create an instance of the point class in my new application. To illustrate inheritance, I'm going to create a new class that derives from the point class that we just did a moment ago. So what we'll do is come down here, and we'll create a new class. The public class, 3D point, and we'll derive from point. And so the first thing we'll do is add a constructor. And we'll add a second constructor. So basically we have an overloaded constructor. But what I want to do is I want to modify these constructors to use the base class's constructor. I'll do that by using the base keyword for both. So the last thing that I want to do here is to add a third point. We already have X and Y, and what we want to do is add Z so we can have a true 3D application. And so what we'll do is create a private field that we're going to call Z. It'll also be an integer. And I'm going to create the modifier and the accessor for the Z field. And to do this, I'm just going to paste in some code I've already written. So I've created a set Z and a get Z statement. And also what I want to do is in our constructor, in this second constructor, I'm going to allow it to be set to the value that's passed in. So before we continue on, what I'd like to do is explain exactly what happened here. First of all, I've created a new class. I've derived it from an old class in a whole different assembly called point. We created that earlier this lesson and especially in the previous lesson. And what I want to do is extend the functionality of the point class to basically take in one more value. We had x and y. We wanted to add the concept of a z. And we borrowed from the constructors. You recall in our in the point class we had two constructors, one that took no arguments, and therefore it hard-coded those values in to the x and y parameters. And what this will do is call the constructor from the base class so that x and y are pre-populated. Then we have a second constructor that's also calls the base class constructor, and it takes care of passing in the x and the y parameters that were passed into our new constructor for the 3D point class. And therefore, it will allow us to set x and y, even though we don't have any code within our method to accommodate that. The only thing we're doing in our second accessor is taking care of the ability to set this value of z. We created a private member field called z, and then we gave it two methods, set z and get z, our accessor and modifier. So now what we'll want to do is reference our new class within our application. Okay, so this allowed us to create a new instance of the 3D point object and pass in 1, 2, and 3 as the parameters. Now I'm going to print these things out to the screen, all three of the values from the TP object, and I'm just going to paste in some code that I've already done to do this, where I do basically tp.getX toString, tp.getY, and tp.getZ. Now that's interesting. Even though our object does not define the getX and getY and setX and setY, because we've derived from the point class, we can still access those values. So now let's compile our application. And then let's go to the directory, and let's give it a whirl. Notice that we have values 1, 2, and 3. This is because we were able to send in those values into the constructor of both the point class, because of its reference from our derived class back to the base class, plus we were able to add in the value z that we implemented from as we derived from that class and added the additional functionality. So that's one of the things about inheritance that we need to talk about, that the real true value of inheritance allows us to save code in a sense, to reuse code, to inherit all the best things about an object and be able to add additional functionality to it. And the best example that I can think of is if we had a class that was car, and it took care of all the calculations, all the discounts that, or all the features of a car that maybe a particular dealership or a particular car manufacturer would have. But perhaps there's one model or one make of car where we want to add on some additional information. So we may have a car class, then we might derive that class and make a Mercedes class. And so we can borrow all the methods and properties and override the ones that make a Mercedes, specifically a Mercedes, as opposed to just any other type of car. And so there's this concept of a base class, which means the car would be a base class, or the point class would be a base class. And then you have the derived class, that which we're using as a base, but moving on from there and adding on additional properties and methods onto that class to make it specific, to make it a unique type of class. And the true value of inheritance is that in your organization you might have a bunch of business objects that define how your business operates. But for your application, you just need to take some of those objects, some of those assemblies that are lying around, and use them within your new application, but you don't want to re-implement all the functionality that was created before. Well, you can derive from some of those business objects, add on a few of your own methods that are specific to this new application that you're building, and have an application that hopefully can be built much quicker than if you had to write everything all over again from scratch to re-implement all the old business rules that you've talked about or that were actually in operation for months and months. So hope that this video helped you understand the value of overloading methods and also the value of inheritance. We learned how to create a reference and how to take code out and put it into its own assembly. We talked a little bit about assemblies. Really, we're not going to focus on assemblies that much in this series of lessons because that's something we'll talk about in a series of lessons on the .NET framework. Because that's an essential concept to .NET. But at any rate, I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned a lot from it. Thank you.